So, in 2003, the state of New York all out banned smoking. No more smoking in restaurants, no more smoking in bars, at work, basically anywhere in the entire state of New York. So that year, the UN Secretary General decided that that ban should extend to the UN headquarters, which is based here in New York. That annoyed many diplomats, including then Russian UN Ambassador Sergei Lavrov. He is a chain smoker, and not only did it annoy him, he made the case, like a diplomat, that the Secretary General had no right to stop them from smoking, that he'd exceeded his legitimate authority. Quote, "The UN building is owned by all the member nations, while the Secretary General is just a hired manager," he said at the time. Yes, Lavrov questioned the legal basis for creating a new rule at the UN. And look, he at least had an argument here. The UN is not actually technically American property. It is in New York, but designated as an international zone. And so he said the rule required an international vote. Naturally. So what's a Putin diplomat to do? Well, Lavrov decided that he would ignore that new rule, and he continued to smoke in the building. Now, whether or not Lavrov's argument holds any water, the incident does kind of provide a window into how he operates. Mr. Lavrov is now, of course, the Russian foreign minister, and really not much has changed. He was known to clash with former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. He made a habit of pushing Condoleezza Rice's buttons, and in 2012, he called then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's comments about the ongoing Syrian conflict hysterical. Yes, he has a history of being pretty gruff with a lot of his counterparts, until 2013 rolled around, and things actually did seem to change a little bit. This is now Secretary of State John Kerry and Mr. Lavrov. And see, this is not a one-of-a-kind photo. Last year, these two were able to negotiate a groundbreaking deal to get Syria to eliminate its chemical weapons, a deal that possibly saved us from bombing Syria and promised to rid another country of chemical weapons. But whether it's Syria or getting Iran to sign on to a nuclear deal, these two have at times, at least in the old times, been called a diplomatic dream team, and they have until recently been known to get things done. They appear to have what we would call a relationship. The New York Times reported last year they formed a bond quickly over late-night dinners and drinks and even garden strolls. John Kerry loves soccer. Lavrov loves soccer. And now their shared hobbies are by no means a defining way to understand the entire geostrategic issues in the region. Diplomacy is words and deeds between counterparts, not just a shared love of wine. But these guys have been able to work together diplomatically. And because they see eye to eye diplomatically, President Obama did dispatch John Kerry to London last night to meet with Lavrov to see if they could get together and ease some of this escalating tension with Russia in, of course, a part of Ukraine called Crimea. 2 weeks ago, as we know, Russia moved into that region. Then President Obama announced sanctions. Then Putin sent more troops in. The situation continues to escalate, tensions at an all-time high. And last week, Crimea, of course, announced plans for a specific referendum to vote on secession from Ukraine and possibly join the Russian Federation. The vote for that happens in 2 days on this Sunday. And yesterday, we learned of a growing buildup of Russian troops along the eastern Ukrainian border. Rachel talked about that last night. It's leaving everyone worried that this is some kind of prelude to another invasion, possibly of the rest of Ukraine. So, the diplomatic dream team had their emergency meeting of sorts today, a last-ditch meeting at the home of the U.S. ambassador in London. They sat in the garden and talked. After 3 hours of talking, well, look here, they decided to take a walk. 4 hours later, they then took a seat there by the flowers. And after 6 hours of walking and talking and doing more talking, they emerged looking like that, with no real easing of any tensions. Now, Kerry said the talks were direct, candid, and frank, but with no diplomatic conclusion.
I was clear with Foreign Minister Lavrov that the President has made it clear there will be consequences if Russia does not find a way to change course. And we don't say that as a threat. We say that as a direct consequence of the choices that Russia may or may not choose to make here.
All right, words matter. Not a threat, Secretary Kerry said, but a consequence of Russia's own choices. And Secretary Lavrov walked out of that 6-hour meeting with his own strong and clear words that Russia and the U.S. have no common vision of this situation, making it clear that Russia isn't prepared to commit to just about anything in relation to Ukraine before that referendum on Sunday. 6 hours of talking. Usually 6-hour meetings of diplomats means 3 hours of conversation and then, well, 3 hours of translation. But in this session, Kerry and Lavrov actually spoke English. Lavrov is perfectly fluent, so this really was a 6-hour power session with, apparently, no real diplomatic conclusion. So what do we make of that? And what does that mean in the light of the referendum on the succession of Crimea this weekend? Well, joining us now is William Taylor, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador Taylor is, I should mention, now vice president at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Ambassador Taylor, thanks for joining us tonight.
Glad to be here.
Let's start with words and diplomacy. We are accustomed to following these meetings, whether long or short, and hearing very parsed, careful summaries. We heard something, I think, more blunt today, right?
We did. It's clear that through the 6 hours of discussions, they did not agree. Secretary Kerry made it very clear what we had in mind, and Mr. Lavrov had a very different view. We have different views of what should happen on Sunday, which is this referendum. We don't think that should happen.
And we don't think, according to the U.S. policy at this point, that it's legitimate. And yet, Ambassador, when you look at these kind of meetings, they are surely not designed from the U.S. side as window dressing. Walk us through, especially with your experience in these kind of forums, what happens when you have one side like the Obama administration trying to get something out and apparently Putin happy to talk and listen, but not moving an inch?
Not moving an inch. Mr. Putin does seem to be sure that he's going to allow this referendum to go forward in violation of the Ukrainian constitution, in violation of international law, in violation of his commitments to the international community. He understands, I believe, that this will isolate him. He has already been isolated. The Europeans have been very clear that they will take measures to sanction people around the president. They will not be able to travel to Europe. They'll not be able to have access to their London townhouses. This is a big problem for many people in Russia, and yet it doesn't seem to bother President Putin. Secretary Kerry has made it clear that we will take further steps. The United States will take further steps if this proceeds, if this referendum takes place, and if the Russians proceed on that basis to annex Crimea. So this discussion apparently went back and forth for some time, and neither side convinced the other.
And Ambassador, as the U.S. says it will take those further steps, and Secretary Kerry again spoke at least about the Russian markets and severe economic consequences in result of further action, it is clear that Russia is amassing, as we've been reporting last night and today, troops on the border of Ukraine in a different area looking towards eastern Ukraine. Russia's taking its own actions here. How concerned should we be?
I believe we should be very concerned. The size of the troops that the Russians have amassed on their side of the border is very troubling. It's not just troops; it's equipment. It's mobile equipment. It has the capability. These troops and this equipment and these forces have the ability to move across that border. They've also been putting other things across the border already. That is, provocateurs. The Russians have been busing young men into Ukrainian cities across the border in Ukraine and causing difficulties, causing problems, causing riots, causing people pushing back and forth. There was a man who was killed yesterday. One of the people who are supporting the Kyiv government was killed in one of those pushes that was prompted by the Russian provocateurs coming across the border. So that is a very dangerous situation with those kinds of troops sitting close by.
And briefly, Ambassador, how much of this conflict ultimately turns on the fact that this is much more important land to Russia than it will ever be to the U.S. or many of the European countries? This is not our Cuba. This is not our Hawaii.
This is not territorially important for the United States, but there's a very important principle for us and even more important for the Europeans. If Europe goes from the Atlantic to the Urals, then Ukraine is smack in the middle. Ukraine is in the middle of Europe. It is a European country. It hopes to be able to live by European rules. It would like to join European institutions. It would like to have the ability to make that choice themselves. And this is a value, this is a principle that we care about as well. rules that have governed the European continent since 1945 through the Cold War and then since the Cold War have meant that borders don't change. What President Putin is threatening is to change borders by force, and this ought to concern us all.
Understood, and appreciate your insights tonight, especially given all your service in the region. William Taylor, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, turning to some politics. If you are a fan of amazing verbal smackdowns of U.S. senators, and who isn't, well, we have a piece of tape that I think you should see. It is on the subject of health care, but it is about, well, total ownership. It's coming up. Stay with us.